us, what is shaping how we think about immigration? And I'd like to juxtapose two different ways we, or our society, might tend to think about immigration. Let me start by mentioning some of the popular images and signs that we've seen all over the news in recent months. And let me just read to you some of these signs that we've seen as people have been protesting some of these undocumented immigrants on their way to holding facilities, for example. This is what some of the signs have said. Send the illegals back. Return to sender. Save our children from diseases. Take them away from here. Stand your ground, USA. I pay taxes. And then, perhaps the most disturbing, nobody wants you. You are not welcome here. Go back home. I want to ask the question, what would cause people to make those kinds of statements? And I want to suggest that there are three primary motivations or beliefs that sort of underlie those kinds of statements, those kinds of signs that are often representative of many of the people that we may know, may even have found their way into our own hearts in the past or even now. What causes people to think like this and to say these kinds of really horrendous things about other human lives? And in this case, even children. Let me give you three reasons why I think people might say these kinds of things. The first one is the primary motivation is one of fear. There's a fear of others, a fear of those who are not like us, who are different. They may really be different or just seem to be different in some way. And this comes out in terms of, oftentimes, in the irrational, save our children from diseases. It comes out in other kinds of statements like, we're scared or we're worried about the way in which these immigrants are going to bring violence to our community. We're worried or we're afraid about the way in which economic systems are going to be exploited or taken advantage of. It's manifested in the way in which people will say, we're going to lose our distinctive heritage. We're going to lose our distinctive Americanism, right? And that's why it's often, frequently at least, in our country, connected with a certain form of patriotism. So there is, first of all, underlying this popular rhetoric of fear of others. This often leads then to a second point, to ethnic or racial or cultural forms of stereotyping. So we've heard this all before as well, right? Certain kinds of stereotypes of those who are others, those who are different from us. So the immigrants, they may be lazy and shiftless. They may be violent. It may be said that they're going to refuse to actually learn our language. They're dirty. They carry diseases. It sort of tends to just, snowball into a form of, because I'm afraid of the other, therefore any kind of stereotype that enables me to then label that person as other is on the table. So not only do we see fear leading to ethnic stereotyping, but then thirdly, we find this manifested obviously in the goal for many of these people, namely exclusion. So we need to, for example, the argument goes, we need to protect our borders. We need to safeguard our country and thereby build up greater walls or fences that will protect our borders. It's manifested in oftentimes an implicit refusal to welcome others even into our own churches. So within this kind of popular rhetoric, let me say one more time what we frequently see. We see fear of others. We see that then manifesting itself in ethnic or some kind of cultural stereotyping of the other that then ultimately leads to a form of exclusion or inhospitality whereby we refuse, in terms of whoever the we is, we refuse to actually welcome others into our own relationships or into our own actual literal space, our homes and our churches. But obviously, as Christians, as those who follow Jesus and have the legacy of the sacred scriptures, we know that there is a different and better way than this to which Jesus and to which the scriptures call us. So I want to suggest to you three different ways of responding. Let me suggest to you, first of all, and I'll repeat this, but that first of all, as God's people, we are, instead of fearing immigrants, we are called to recognize that being an immigrant people is part of the fabric of our own Christian identity. Let me say that one more time. As God's people, instead of fearing immigrants, We are called to recognize that an immigrant people is built into the very fabric of our own Christian identity. Can you think of any immigrants in the Old Testament? Or in this, we could just open that up to the entire scriptures. I mean, as soon as you ask the question, it becomes a little bit silly, because the Bible's heroes is filled with people who are also immigrants or strangers. So for example, let me give you a few of them. Every single patriarch in the Old Testament is at one time or another referred to as a sojourner or as an immigrant, right? Abraham in Genesis 12, leave your land and go to the land that I'm going to show you. Later on in Genesis, he has to ask the Hittites if he can have a little bit of land so that he can bury Sarah once she's passed away, because he's an immigrant and he has no claim to the land in which he is in. When the Israelites would give their tithe of their first fruits, a portion of which would go to not only the Levites, but would also go to the widow and the orphan and the immigrant, they were to say this confession every year. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and sojourned there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. Every year when they make this tithe of the first fruits, that confession reinscribes within that people that they are an immigrant people, even once they've already gone into the land. And this is why God himself in Leviticus 25 says, Israel, even when you enter into the land, you don't own the land. It doesn't belong to you. You are simply aliens and tenants before me. Let me give you two more examples of aliens and sojourners and strangers and immigrants in the scriptures. Perhaps the most obvious one is Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. If you see Jesus in the Gospel of Luke from Luke 9 to Luke 19, we have about 10 chapters of him as an immigrant or as a sojourner, as one who is wandering, who begins his journey saying, the birds of the air have their nests, the foxes have a place, have their holes, but the Son of Man has no place to actually lay his head. And the rest of that journey is frequently characterized at times by literal inhospitality from others who meet him. Or we might think about 1 Peter, who begins and ends his epistle by describing the recipients as those who are aliens and chosen sojourners of the diaspora, and those who are living in Babylon in chapter 5, verse 13. Babylon, that is the place of exile. So inscribed within the very identity of God's people is this identity of us as a people who are a wandering, sojourning, immigrant people. Now let me move to point 2. Instead of trading on dehumanizing stereotypes of immigrants, what I was talking about before, instead of engaging in these kinds of stereotypes, as Christians we're called to a belief that our lives can be enriched by relationships with people that seem to be different from us and actually may be different from us. So instead of engaging in these wicked forms of dehumanizing stereotypes, those who follow Jesus are called to believe that people that are different from us actually can be sources of enrichment. Let me give you examples of this from the author Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke as well as the book of Acts. We see here that Luke will frequently raise a stereotype in order only to overturn it or to do away with it. So for example, Roman soldiers, stereotypes of Roman soldiers, extortionists frequently, brutish, violent, thugs. Luke frequently, however, is talking about these Roman soldiers and centurions, activating those kinds of stereotypes only actually to show you that, for example, in Luke 7, it is a centurion to whom Jesus says, I haven't seen faith like this anywhere else in Israel. Or it's a Roman centurion in Acts 10 and 11, who is the initial Gentile convert that is the means whereby God fulfills his promises to make the church a multi-ethnic institution. Or it's Acts 27, where Paul says, where Luke tells us that when Paul was imprisoned and on the ship making his way to Rome, it was a centurion who showed extraordinary kindness to him by allowing others, Paul's friends, to actually come and visit him. So Luke activates this stereotype only to show that it's not a helpful stereotype, only to show that the stereotype actually is overturned by how the human characters of a centurion actually act. Let me give to you one more example. Barbarians, okay? Barbarians in Acts 28. Those who would be people who couldn't speak the Greek language, who would be prone to violence and bizarre customs, and certainly wouldn't show hospitality to strangers. In Acts 28, when Paul is shipwrecked on Malta, and we see that there are these barbarians, Luke kind of intends for the reader to think, this is not going to be good for Paul. But what happens is that these barbarians actually become some of the best exemplars of hospitality who show kindness to Paul, and ultimately then the first man of Malta welcomes Paul into his own home. There are many more examples we could talk about. Samaritans, women, Lydia. What Luke is doing here is showing us that stereotypes are not a helpful way of actually making sense of human life and human characters. And these human characters, who are these characters in the Gospel of Luke, are actually some of the heroes of Luke's Gospel. The Samaritans, the barbarians, the centurions. Third and final point. Instead of excluding the other from relational space or literal space, and instead of denying them access to this kind of space, we are called to create space, both relational as well as literal, where others can be welcomed and treated as family. Let me just give you a couple of examples of this, one from the Old Testament and one or two from the New. In the Old Testament, we're familiar with Leviticus 18 at least, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you then read someone might ask you, well, tell me, who is my neighbor? If you read then through the end of Leviticus 19, you'll find that who is to be the object of love. At the end of Leviticus 19, it says this: when an immigrant resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the immigrant. The immigrant who resides with you, note this, shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the immigrant yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You may remember the story of the Good Samaritan. It's already to some extent here in the scriptures in terms of who is my neighbor. It's not just the person I like, that I think of as the insider kind of person that's like me. It's the outsider, the alien, the immigrant to whom we are to extend love. Or Deuteronomy 10:17. Again, I wish I could just go through all of these texts. I'm just giving you some representative examples. But in Deuteronomy 10:17, God says, this is who he is. The Lord your God is the God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger. Notice what God does, and provides them with food and clothing. So you also shall love the stranger, for you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. If we had more time, we could look to see the details of how this actually works out. How the same rules and laws and benefits that apply to the native Israelite are to be extended to the one who is the immigrant or the sojourner. Most climactically, of course, I think we see someone creating space, both literal and relational, in the person of Jesus. Jesus is remembered across all four Gospels as one who celebrated table fellowship with tax collectors, with sinners, with outsiders, with all of the people who weren't technically supposed to be part of the people of God. And it was through his engaging with these people in terms of table fellowship and hospitality, whereby Jesus was able to actually bring the kingdom of God to these people and include them within God's people and share God's presence and God's hospitality with them. And I'll just conclude at this point here by saying this. Jesus is very clear in the Gospel of Luke that the story of Jesus continues in the life of the church. So before he dies, before he goes to the cross, he says, how have I been in your midst? What have I been like? Have I been like one who reclines? Or have I been as one who serves and waits on tables? The implication being, so you disciples, and so you, the rest of the church, are to remember my table fellowship as a time and an opportunity to share God's presence as a servant with those who might not seem like they are insiders or who are like you. So to summarize, instead of fearing immigrants, we recognize that we ourselves are an immigrant people. Instead of dehumanizing stereotypes, we recognize that people different from us can be and often are a source of blessing and enrichment. And instead of exclusion, we are called to be people who seek to create space for others.